Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be starting our next unit, which focuses on the 1920s, the Jazz Age, and the Great Gatsby. In order to fully understand the novel and to get the most that we can from it, it's really important for us to understand the historical background of both when this book was written and also when this book was set. So I'm going to be giving you a brief history lesson today on the historical context of this novel, as well as introducing you to some of the major themes and influences on F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about some themes that you're going to see in this book. And these are the four major themes that you're going to see in The Great Gatsby. The first is the theme of love and lost. Can you get back something that you have lost? Can you repeat the past? Can you find a love again that you've lost earlier in your life? Another major theme is appearance versus reality. So are things always as they seem? Can you trust first impressions? Can you trust what people tell you? Is your perception of reality the same thing as actual reality? Another important theme in The Great Gatsby is the American dream. You might have studied this concept in your history classes, but the American dream is the idea that anyone, regardless of background or race or gender or financial situation, anyone, if they came to America, if they worked hard, and if they were determined, then they could achieve success. That idea of hard work and determination being the sort of touchstones of success was very prevalent in the 1920s. This was a time of great immigration to America, and many people found America to be this land of opportunity. So the idea of the American dream really began here in the 1920s, and I would argue that it exists still to this day. Although you were 100 years after this book was set and published, there's still some idea of the American dream that exists in 2020. And we're going to be talking about how that concept has changed over time. Lastly, a major theme in the book is the impact of wealth. The idea that money, while it can buy you a whole lot of stuff, can it buy you true happiness? So we're going to be wrestling with that question in this book. All right, so switch gears a little bit from the themes of the book to the history. The 1920s was a decade that came after the end of World War I. So World War I ended on November 11th, 1918. And because of the war, there were a lot of changes that happened and that lasted through the 1920s. So this was a period of modernity and breaking from traditions. So kind of getting away from how things always had been, specifically for the roles of women. So while many men were off fighting in the war, women took jobs, and that continued after the end of World War I. So changing roles of women, sort of changing expectations for social behavior. There were new technologies that were being developed, like the radio and film. And this was a period where people tried to sort of escape the horrors of the war. So they turned to amusement and fun and lightness in an effort to get away from the horrors of World War I. So they turned to dancing and music and alcohol in order to escape some of those harsher realities. Again, the idea of American prosperity and optimism was very prevalent in this time. That concept of the American dream lasted throughout the decade. So the 1920s appeared to be a time of huge wealth, but that perception was actually an illusion. The economy may have been booming, but there was still a problem with wealth distribution, specifically between the middle and upper classes. So people made a lot of bad stock investments due to overconfidence in the economy. And as we know from our history classes, the 1920s and sort of the recklessness of this time period would lead to the stock market crash in 1929, which would then go on to turn into the Great Depression in the 1930s. There's an image from Wall Street in the 1920s. You see how bustling it was, how many people were out there, how sort of confident and optimistic it seemed. But what you don't see is obviously, they say that hindsight is 2020, right? So when we're looking back on this now in 2020, we know that right over on the other side of the horizon was the Great Depression. So this huge wealth, this huge confidence, this huge optimism was really just on the other side of it was financial ruin and disaster. Another important thing to talk about in the 1920s is the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance began in an area of New York called Harlem, a neighborhood called Harlem. And this was an area where it was primarily African American. And this was not just a place for literature, but this was a place for literature, art, music, dance, social commentary. All of these things started to come out of Harlem, a section of New York City. And it didn't just transform African American identity and history, but it also transformed American culture in general, because never before had so many Americans been able to hear and to read and to explore the thoughts of African Americans. So remember, this isn't that far off from the end of the Civil War, which was 1865. So many people who had lived in the South, they fled to the North for safety, and would go on then to tell their stories and create this art that really became indicative of an entire generation. We're going to talk about 3 people that you should know. There were a lot of important people in the Harlem Renaissance, but 3 people that you should know are Langston Hughes, Billie Holiday, and Louis Armstrong. This is Langston Hughes. He was a poet. This video I'm going to post for you to read or to watch. It is him actually himself reading his most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So after you watch this lesson, go on and listen to Langston Hughes read his most famous poem. Billie Holiday was a singer and a musician, and she was hugely influential on pop culture and in pop music. It might not sound that different to us, but based on what people were listening to up until this point, Billie Holiday was hugely different. Her unique vocal stylings, the way that she interacted with the audience, these things were new and exciting. So after you've watched this, you should listen to Billie Holiday. Lastly, Louis Armstrong. This is a snippet from his from a performance in 1927, so a little bit later in the 1920s. But he was also a musician like Billie Holiday, but he was a trumpeter, a composer, and he had a big impact on music as well. I should mention that the Billie Holiday song you're going to hear is from the 40s, but it was recorded in the 40s, but it was written in the 20s. So with these new sounds of jazz music, there were new dances that were created. You guys might have heard of swing dancing before. These are a couple of different types of swing dancing, the Charleston, the Lindy Hop, the Balboa. You can watch this video, which is actually from a movie, but it gives you a good idea of what this kind of dance looked like. So if you go into a Halloween store and you look for flappers and gangsters, you're going to see outfits that look very similar to the flapper fashion of the 1920s. So you see these girls are wearing short dresses, they're wearing bowler hats, their hair is cut short. And again, this was very risque for the 1920s. Up until this point, sort of the expectation for women was to be quiet and demure and covered up. But in the 1920s, women started cutting their shorts or their skirts shorter, and they started cutting their hair shorter. And again, while this might not seem like a big deal to us, in the 1920s, it would have been kind of like cutting your hair would have been the same thing as like going to get a tattoo. It would have been rebellious and, sort of frowned upon by the older generations. And again, this was very fashionable in the 1920s, but it was also not just a look, it was more about an attitude. For men, nothing quite as over the top, but men wore a lot of suits during this time period. That kind of collegiate style with the hats and the bow ties was very popular. So automobiles in the 1920s, Ford made the first affordable automobile with the Model T, and cars, it's really changed the landscape. It changed the way that people were able to travel. They no longer had to live near railroads anymore. They could just get in their car and go. And cars were also, as they are today, a status symbol. Movie stars, I gave you a couple of pictures here of some famous actors and actresses from the 1920s. This was really the decade that film was born, and also the idea of the American celebrity. So while today we have the Kardashians, in the 1920s, we had people like Greta Garbo. The last thing we need to talk about for our understanding of the Great Gatsby is the era of Prohibition. Prohibition, or the dry law, or the 18th Amendment, happened on January 16th, 1920, and the United States went dry on this day. That meant that breweries, distilleries, saloons, they were forced to close their doors. Anywhere that bought or sold alcohol was no longer allowed to do so anymore. This was fueled by a lot of factors, but one of the major ones was the temperance movement, which was a social group that found alcohol to be evil, and they wanted to eliminate it by making it illegal. It had a lot of names: the Dry Law, 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, National Prohibition Act, and it defined intoxicating beverages as anything more than 0.5% alcohol. So the effects of Prohibition, we all know, first of all, that it didn't last because it quickly produced bootleggers, speakeasies, moonshine, bathtub gin, and other homemade alcohols, as well as illegal transport of that alcohol. And the irony of it is that it actually backfired. There was an estimated 30,000 illegal speakeasies in 1927, and this is twice the number of legal bars before Prohibition. So drinking actually increased during this time period. It ultimately failed, Prohibition did, because it was unenforceable, so people would continue to drink even though it was technically illegal. But by the mid-20s, police were not investigating any violations of alcohol consumption just because they couldn't control it. Okay, the next thing that you are going to do is you're going to continue learning more about the 1920s by going onto your Common Lit. There's an assignment there called the Roaring 20s. When you get to Common Lit, just log in, click on Login with Google, log in with your Wake ID, and then it should take you directly to that reading assignment, and then answer the questions when you're done. If you are interested in learning more about the 1920s, I'm going to post this link as well, which is the John Green crash course on the 1920s, on the decade of the 1920s. So if you're confused about anything that I've talked about, or if you just want to learn a little bit more about the 1920s, you can go to this website to find out more.